Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and in it we're continuing our reading of Marx's Kapital, Volume 1, with the first chapter in Part 5 of 8, Production of Absolute and Relative Surplus Value, Chapter 16, Absolute and Relative Surplus Value. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So Part 5 overall is a pretty short part. It is comprised of just 3 fairly short chapters. If you were paying attention during the earlier parts, particularly parts 3 and 4, the production of absolute and the production of relative surplus value, then I think you'll have no problem with this part, as basically Marx takes all of those concepts and shows how they are interrelated. Without further ado, let's begin. Chapter 16. Absolute and Relative Surplus Value. In considering the labor process, we began in Chapter 7 by treating it in the abstract, apart from its historical forms, as a process between humans and nature. We there stated, if we examine the whole labor process from the point of view of its result, it is plain that both the instruments and the subject of labor are means of production, and that the labor itself is productive labor. And in Note 2, same page, we further added this method of determining from the standpoint of the labor process alone what is productive labor is by no means directly applicable to the case of the capitalist process of production. We now proceed to the further development of this subject. So far as the labor process is purely individual, one and the same laborer unites in themselves all the functions that later on become separated. When an individual appropriates natural objects for their livelihood, no one controls them but themselves. Afterwards, they are controlled by others. A single person cannot operate upon nature without calling their own muscles into play, under the control of their own brain. As in the natural body, head and hand wait upon each other, so the labor process unites the labor of the hand with that of the head. Later on, they part company and even become deadly foes. The product ceases to be the direct product of the individual and becomes a social product, produced in common by a common laborer, i.e. by a combination of workers, each of whom only takes a part, greater or less, in the manipulation of the subject of their labor. As the cooperative character of the labor process becomes more and more marked, so as a necessary consequence does our notion of productive labor, and of its agent, the productive laborer, become extended. In order to labor productively, it is no longer necessary for you to do manual work yourself. Enough if you are an organ of the collective laborer and perform one of its subordinate functions. The first definition given above of productive labor, a definition deduced from the very nature of the production of material objects, still remains correct for the collective laborer considered as a whole, but it no longer holds good for each member taken individually. On the other hand, however, our notion of productive labor becomes narrowed. Capitalist production is not merely the production of commodities, it is essentially the production of surplus value. The laborer produces not for themselves but for capital. It no longer suffices, therefore, that they should simply produce. They must produce surplus value. That laborer alone is productive who produces surplus value for the capitalist, and thus works for the self-expansion of capital. If we take an example from outside the sphere of production of material objects, a schoolmaster is a productive laborer when, in addition to belaboring the heads of his scholars, he works like a horse to enrich the school proprietor. That the latter has laid out his capital in a teaching factory instead of a sausage factory. Comment, see the introduction of the old TV show You Can't Do That on Television for more, continuing, does not alter the relation. Hence the notion of a productive laborer implies not merely a relation between work and useful effect, between laborer and product of labor, but also a specific social relation of production, a relation that has sprung up historically and stamps the laborer as the direct means of creating surplus value. To be a productive laborer is, therefore, not a piece of luck, but a misfortune. In Book 4, which treats of the history of the theory, it will be more clearly seen that the production of surplus value has at all times been made, by classical political economists, the distinguishing characteristic of the productive laborer. Hence their definition of a productive laborer changes with their comprehension of the nature of surplus value. Thus the physiocrats insist that only agricultural labor is productive, since that alone, they say, yields a surplus value. And they say so because, with them, surplus value has no existence except in the form of rent. The prolongation of the working day beyond the point at which the laborer would have produced just an equivalent for the value of their labor power, and the appropriation of that surplus labor by capital, this is production of absolute surplus value. It forms the general groundwork of the capitalist system, and the starting point for the production of relative surplus value. The latter presupposes that the working day is already divided into two parts, necessary labor and surplus labor. In order to prolong the surplus labor, the necessary labor is shortened by methods whereby the equivalent for the wages is produced in less time. The production of absolute surplus value turns exclusively upon the length of the working day. The production of relative surplus value revolutionizes out and out the technical processes of labor and the composition of society. It therefore presupposes a specific mode, the capitalist mode of production, a mode which, along with its methods, means, and conditions, arises and develops itself spontaneously on the foundation afforded by the formal subjection of labor to capital. In the course of this development, the formal subjection is replaced by the real subjection of labor to capital. It will suffice merely to refer to certain intermediate forms, in which surplus labor is not extorted by direct compulsion from the producer, nor the producer themselves yet formally subjected to capital. In such forms, capital has not yet acquired the direct control of the labor process. By the side of independent producers who carry on their handicrafts and agriculture in the traditional old-fashioned way, there stands the usurer, or the merchant, with their usurer's capital, or merchant's capital, feeding on them like a parasite. The predominance in a society of this form of exploitation excludes the capitalist mode of production, to which mode, however, this form may serve as a transition, as it did toward the close of the Middle Ages. Finally, as is shown by modern, quote, domestic industry, some intermediate forms are here and there reproduced in the background of modern industry, though their physiognomy is totally changed. If, on the one hand, the mere formal subjection of labor to capital suffices for the production of absolute surplus value, if, e.g., it is sufficient that handicraftsmen who previously worked on their own account, or as apprentices of a master, should become wage laborers under the direct control of a capitalist, so on the other hand we've seen how the methods of producing relative surplus value are, at the same time, methods of producing absolute surplus value. Nay more, the excessive prolongation of the working day turned out to be the peculiar product of modern industry. Generally speaking, the specifically capitalist mode of production ceases to be a mere means of producing relative surplus value, so soon as that mode has conquered an entire branch of production, and still more so soon as it has conquered all the important branches. It then becomes the general, socially predominant form of production. So commenting, I want to reread that sentence because I think it's really key. Generally speaking, the specifically capitalist mode of production ceases to be a mere means of producing relative surplus value, so soon as that mode has conquered an entire branch of production, and still more so soon as it has conquered all the important branches. It then becomes the general, socially predominant form of production. So, that's the end of the quote. On the other side of that, when we are moving beyond capitalism to socialism, this is why the conquest first of the most important branches of industry. This is in contrast to the message of the mutualist cooperative types who want to establish some kind of socialism by mashing together somewhat marginal economic crumbs around the periphery of the economy. Anyway, continuing. As a special method of producing relative surplus value, it remains effective only first, insofar as it seizes upon industries that previously were only formally subject to capital, that is, so far as it is propagandist. Secondly, insofar as the industries that have been taken over by it continue to be revolutionized by changes in the methods of production. From one standpoint, any distinction between absolute and relative surplus value appears illusory. Relative surplus value is absolute, since it compels the absolute prolongation of the working day beyond the labor time necessary to the existence of the laborer themselves. Absolute surplus value is relative, since it makes necessary such a development of the productiveness of labor as will allow of the necessary labor time being confined to a portion of the working day. But if we keep in mind the behavior of surplus value, this appearance of identity vanishes. Once the capitalist mode of production is established and becomes general, the difference between absolute and relative surplus value makes itself felt whenever there's a question of raising the rate of surplus value. Assuming that labor power is paid for at its value, we are confronted by this alternative. given the productiveness of labor and its normal intensity, the rate of surplus value can be raised only by the actual prolongation of the working day. On the other hand, given the length of the working day, that rise can be effected only by a change in the relative magnitudes of the components of the working day, viz., necessary labor and surplus labor, a change which, if the wages are not to fall below the value of labor power, presupposes a change either in the productiveness or in the intensity of the labor. If the laborer wants all their time to produce the necessary means of subsistence for themselves and their race, they have no time left in which to work gratis for others. Without a certain degree of productiveness in their labor, they have no such superfluous time at their disposal. Without such superfluous time, no surplus labor, and therefore no capitalists, no slave owners, no feudal lords. In one word, no class of large proprietors. Footnote quoting Ramsey, the very existence of the master capitalists as a distinct class is dependent on the productiveness of industry. And quoting Ravenstone, if each man's labor were enough but to produce his own food, there could be no property. Unquote, back to the main text. Thus, we may say that surplus value rests on a natural basis, but this is permissible only in the very general sense that there is no natural obstacle absolutely preventing one person from disburdening themselves of the labor requisite for their own existence and burdening another with it, any more, for instance, than unconquerable natural obstacles prevent one person from eating the flesh of another. Footnote, according to a recent calculation, there are yet at least 4 million cannibals in those parts of the earth which have already been explored. Back to the main text. No mystical ideas must in any way be connected, as sometimes happens, with this historically developed productiveness of labor. It is only after humans have raised themselves above the rank of animals, when therefore their labor has been to some extent socialized, that a state of things arises in which the surplus labor of the one becomes a condition of existence for the other. At the dawn of civilization, the productiveness acquired by labor is small, but so too are the wants which develop with and by the means of satisfying them. Further, at that early period, the portion of society that lives on the labor of others is infinitely small compared with the mass of direct producers. Along with the progress in the productiveness of labor, that small portion of society increases both absolutely and relatively. Footnote, quoting the advantages of the East India trade, etc. Among the wild Indians in America, almost everything is the laborers. 99 parts of 100 are to be put upon the account of labor. In England, perhaps, the laborer has not 2/3. Unquote, back to the main text. Besides, capital with its accompanying relations springs up from an economic soil that is the product of a long process of development. The productiveness of labor that serves as its foundation and starting point is a gift, not of nature, but of a history embracing thousands of centuries. Apart from the degree of development, greater or less, in the form of social production, the productiveness of labor is fettered by physical conditions. These are all referable to the constitution of humans themselves and to surrounding nature. The external physical conditions fall into two great economic classes. 1. Natural wealth in means of subsistence, i.e. a fruitful soil, waters teeming with fish, etc. And 2. Natural wealth in the instruments of labor, such as waterfalls, navigable rivers, wood, metal, coal, etc. At the dawn of civilization, it is the first class that turns the scale. At a higher stage of development, it is the second. Compare, for example, England with India, or, in ancient times, Athens and Corinth with the shores of the Black Sea. The fewer the number of natural wants imperatively calling for satisfaction, and the greater the natural fertility of the soil and the favorableness of the climate, so much less is the labor time necessary for the maintenance and reproduction of the producer. So much greater, therefore, can be the excess of their labors for others over their labor for themselves. Diodorus long ago remarked this in relation to the ancient Egyptians. Quote, "It is altogether incredible how little trouble and expense the bringing up of their children causes them. They cook for them the first simple food at hand. They also give them the lower part of the papyrus stem to eat so far as it can be roasted in the fire, and the roots and stalks of marsh plants, some raw, some boiled and roasted. Most of the children go without shoes and unclothed, for the air is so mild. Hence a child, until they are grown up, costs their parents not more on the whole than 20 drachmas. It is this, chiefly, which explains why the population of Egypt is so numerous, and therefore why so many great works can be undertaken." Unquote. Nevertheless, the grand structures of ancient Egypt are less due to the extent of its population than to the large proportion of it that was freely disposable. Just as the individual laborer can do more surplus labor in proportion as their necessary labor time is less, so with regard to the working population. the smaller the part of it which is required for the production of the necessary means of subsistence, so much the greater is the part that can be set to do other work. Capitalist production once assumed, then, all other circumstances remaining the same, and given the length of the working day, the quantity of surplus labor will vary with the physical conditions of labor, especially with the fertility of the soil. But it by no means follows from this that the most fruitful soil is the most fitted for the growth of the capitalist mode of production. This mode is based on the dominion of man over nature. Where nature is too lavish, she, quote, keeps him in hand like a child in leading strings. She does not impose upon him any necessity to develop himself. Footnote, quote, the first, natural wealth, as it is most noble and advantageous, so doth it make the people careless, proud, and given to all excesses, whereas the second enforceth vigilancy, literature, arts, and policy. That's quoting England's Treasure by Foreign Trade, or The Balance of Our Foreign Trade is the Rule of Our Treasure, by Thomas Munn of London, merchant, and now published for the common good by his son John Munn, London, 1669. Then another quote, nor can I conceive a greater curse upon a body of people than to be thrown upon a spot of land where the productions for subsistence and food were, in great measure, spontaneous, and the climate required or admitted little care for raiment and covering. There may be an extreme on the other side. A soil incapable of produce by labor is quite as bad as a soil that produces plentifully without any labor. That's quoting An Inquiry into the Present High Price of Provisions, London, 1767. Back to the main text. It is not the tropics with their luxuriant vegetation, but the temperate zone that is the mother country of capital. It is not the mere fertility of the soil, but the differentiation of the soil, the variety of its natural products, the changes of the seasons, which form the physical basis for the social division of labor, and which, by changes in the natural surroundings, spur humans on to the multiplications of our wants, our capabilities, our means, and modes of labor. It is the necessity of bringing a natural force under the control of society, of economizing, of appropriating or subduing it on a large scale by the work of human hands, that first plays the decisive part in the history of industry. Examples are the irrigation works in Egypt, Lombardy, Holland, or in India and Persia, where irrigation by means of artificial canals not only supplies the soil with the water indispensable to it, but also carries down to it, in the shape of sediment from the hills, mineral fertilizers. The secret of the flourishing state of industry in Spain and Sicily under the dominion of the Arabs lay in their irrigation works. 2 footnotes there. First, the necessity for predicting the rise and fall of the Nile created Egyptian astronomy, and with it, the dominion of the priests as directors of agriculture. Quote, the solstice is the moment of the year when the Nile begins to rise, and it is the moment the Egyptians have had to watch for with the greatest attention. It was the evolution of the tropical year which they had to establish firmly, so as to conduct their agricultural operations in accordance with it. They therefore had to search the heavens for a visible sign of the solstice's return. That's from Cuvier's Discourse on the Revolutions of the Globe, Paris, 1863. And second, one of the material bases of the power of the state over the small, disconnected producing organisms in India was the regulation of the water supply. The Mohammedan rulers of India understood this better than their English successors. It is enough to recall the famine of 1866, which cost the lives of more than 1 million Hindus in the district of Orissa in the Bengal Presidency. Back to the main text. Favorable natural conditions alone give us only the possibility, never the reality, of surplus labor, nor consequently of surplus value and a surplus product. The result of difference in the natural conditions of labor is this, that the same quantity of labor suffices, in different countries, a different mass of requirements, consequently that under circumstances in other respects analogous, the necessary labor time is different. Footnote, quote, there are no 2 countries which furnish an equal number of the necessaries of life in equal plenty, and with the same quantity of labor. Men's wants increase or diminish with the severity or temperateness of the climate they live in. Consequently, the proportion of trade which the inhabitants of different countries are obliged to carry on through necessity cannot be the same, nor is it practical to ascertain the degree of variation farther than by the degrees of heat and cold, from whence one may make this general conclusion that the quantity of labor required for a certain number of people is greatest in cold climates and least in hot ones. For in the former, men not only want more clothes, but the earth more cultivating than in the latter. That's quoting from An Essay on the Governing Causes of the Natural Rate of Interest, London, 1750. Marx adds, the author of this epoch-making anonymous work is J. Massey. Hume took his theory of interest from it. Back to the main text. These conditions affect surplus labor only as natural limits, i.e. by fixing the points at which labor for others can begin. In proportion as industry advances, these natural limits recede. In the midst of our West European society, where the laborer purchases the right to work for their own livelihood only by paying for it in surplus labor, the idea easily takes root that it is an inherent quality of human labor to furnish a surplus product. Footnote. Quoting Proudhon, all labor must leave a surplus. This appears to be part of the rights and duties of the citizen. Back to the main text. But consider, for example, an inhabitant of the eastern islands of the Asiatic archipelago, where sago grows wild in the forests. Quote, when the inhabitants have convinced themselves, by boring a hole in the tree, that the pith is ripe, the trunk is cut down and divided into several pieces. The pith is extracted, mixed with water, and filtered. It is then quite fit for use as sago. One tree commonly yields 300 pounds and occasionally 500 to 600 pounds. There then people go into the forests and cut bread for themselves, just as with us they cut firewood. That's quoting F. Chauve. Suppose now such an Eastern bread cutter requires 12 working hours for the satisfaction of all their wants. Nature's direct gift to them is plenty of leisure time. Before they can apply this leisure time productively for themselves, a whole series of historical events is required. Before they spend it in surplus labor for strangers, compulsion is necessary. If capitalist production were introduced, the honest fellow would perhaps have to work 6 days a week in order to appropriate to himself the product of one working day. The bounty of nature does not explain why he would then have to work 6 days a week, or why he must furnish 5 days of surplus labor. It only explains why his necessary labor time would be limited to 1 day a week. But in no case would his surplus product arise from some occult quality inherent in human labor. Thus, not only does the historically developed social productiveness of labor, but also its natural productiveness appear to be productiveness of the capital with which that labor is incorporated. Ricardo never concerns himself about the origin of surplus value. He treats it as a thing inherent in the capitalist mode of production, which mode, in his eyes, is the natural form of social production. Whenever he discusses the productiveness of labor, he seeks in it not the cause of surplus value, but the cause that determines the magnitude of that value. On the other hand, his school has openly proclaimed the productiveness of labor to be the originating cause of profit. Read surplus value. This, at all events, is a progress as against the mercantilists who, on their side, derive the excess of the price over the cost of production of the product, from the act of exchange, from the product being sold above its value. Nevertheless, Ricardo's school simply shirked the problem. They did not solve it. In fact, these bourgeois economists instinctively saw, and rightly so, that it is very dangerous to stir too deeply the burning question of the origin of surplus value. But what are we to think of John Stuart Mill, who, half a century after Ricardo, solemnly claims superiority over the mercantilists by clumsily repeating the wretched evasions of Ricardo's earliest vulgarizers? Mill says, quote, the cause of profit is that labor produces more than is required for its support, unquote. So far, nothing but the old story. But Mill, wishing to add something of his own, proceeds, quote, to vary the form of the theorem, the reason why capital yields a profit is because food, clothing, materials, and tools last longer than the time which was required to produce them, unquote. He here confounds the duration of labor time with the duration of its products. According to this view, a baker whose product lasts only a day could never extract from his workpeople the same profit as a machine maker whose products endure for 20 years and more. Of course, it is very true that if a bird's nest did not last longer than the time it takes in building, birds would have to do without nests. This fundamental truth once established, Mill establishes his own superiority over the mercantilists. Quote, we thus see, he proceeds, that profit arises not from the incident of exchange, but from the productive power of labor, and the general profit of the country is always what the productive power of labor makes it, whether any exchange takes place or not. If there were no division of employments, there would be no buying or selling, but there still would be profit, unquote. For Mill, then, exchange, buying and selling, those general conditions of capitalist production, are but an incident, and there would always be profits even without the purchase and sale of labor power. Quote, if, he continues, the laborers of the country collectively produce 20% more than their wages, profits will be 20%, whatever prices may or may not be, unquote. This is, on the one hand, a rare bit of tautology, for if laborers produce a surplus value of 20% for the capitalist, his profit will be to the total wages of the laborers as 20 to 100. On the one hand, it is absolutely false to say that, quote, profits will be 20%. They will always be less because they are calculated upon the sum total of the capital advanced. If, for example, the capitalists have advanced £500, of which 400 is laid out in means of production, and 100 in wages, and if the rate of surplus value be 20%, the rate of profit will be 20 to 500, i.e. 4%, not 20%. Then follows a splendid example of Mill's method of handling the different historical forms of social production. Quote, I assume throughout the state of things which, where the laborers and capitalists are separate classes, prevails, with few exceptions, universally, namely that the capitalist advances the whole expenses, including the entire remuneration of the laborer. Unquote. Strange optical illusion to see everywhere a state of things which as yet exists only exceptionally on our earth. Footnote, in earlier editions of Kapital, the quotation from John Stuart Mill, quote, I assume throughout of the laborer, had been given incorrectly. The words, where the laborers and capitalists are separate classes, having been left out. Marx, in a letter dated November 28, 1878, pointed this out to Danielson, the Russian translator of Kapital, adding, quote, the next two sentences, viz., strange optical illusion to see everywhere a state of things which as yet exists only exceptionally on our earth, but let us finish, should be deleted and the following sentence substituted. Quote, Mr. Mill is good enough to believe that this state of things is not an absolute necessity, even in that economic system in which, quote, laborers and capitalists are separate classes, unquote. The substance of this note has been taken from the Volksausgabe. The quotation from Mill is from his Principles of Political Economy, Book 2, Chapter 15. Back to the main text. But let us finish. Mill is willing to concede, quote, that he should do so is not a matter of inherent necessity. Unquote. On the contrary, quote, the laborer might wait until the production is complete for all that part of his wages which exceeds mere necessaries, and even for the whole, if he has funds in hand sufficient for his temporary support. But in the latter case, the laborer is to that extent really a capitalist in the concern, by supplying a portion of the funds necessary for carrying it on. Unquote. Mill might have gone further and have added that the laborer who advances to themselves not only the necessaries of life, but also the means of production, is in reality nothing but their own wage laborer. He might also have said that the American peasant proprietor is but a serf who does enforced labor for himself instead of for his lord. After thus proving clearly that even if capitalist production had no existence, still it would always exist, Mill is consistent enough to show on the contrary that it has no existence, even when it does exist. Quote, and even in the former case, Marx adds, when the workman is a wage laborer to whom the capitalist advances all the necessaries of life, he, the laborer, quote, may be looked upon in the same light, i.e. as a capitalist, since contributing his labor at less than the market price, here Marx adds a parenthetical exclamation point as if to say, oh really, he may be regarded as lending the difference, parenthetical question mark for Marx, to his employer and receiving it back with interest, etc. That's quoting Mill's Principles of Political Economy. In reality, the laborer advances their labor gratuitously to the capitalist during, say, 1 week, in order to receive the market price at the end of the week, etc. And it is this which, according to Mill, transforms them into a capitalist. On the level plain, simple mounds look like hills, and the imbecile flatness of the present bourgeoisie is to be measured by the altitude of its great intellects. And that is the end of Chapter 16, Marx hitting Mill with some quality sass there at the end. Anyway, I think this chapter was fairly straightforward, and if you got most of the main concepts from the previous 2 parts of the book, most of what was in this chapter I think is right in line with that and should be pretty clear, but if you have a question or comment, leave it in the comment section below, and we will continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do otherwise. We don't run ads, and we are purely supported by viewer donations. So if you like this channel, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe. And remember, we can agitate and educate to a fair extent online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here from your viewings of this channel and apply it to the struggle going on in your area, in your local left, etc. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.